Okay, today we're diving into a topic that's, well, it's often shrouded in mystery, isn't it?
Hmm.
Frequently sensationalized and always deeply complex. Cults.
Right.
It's such a thorny issue because what truly defines a cult, that's highly subjective.
It really is.
The line between, what we label a cult and what we see as a religion can be incredibly fine.
Very fine.
And then to make it even more complicated, you have members who will insist they're involved completely of their own free will, that they're living perfectly happy
Yeah,
lives.
that's a common defense you hear.
So our goal today is really to move beyond those surface assumptions and try to understand the underlying dynamics.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive isn't just about what is a cult, but really unpacking the how. How do they operate? How do they manage to draw people in? What are the specific psychological mechanisms at play? So we've dug into our source material and extracted what we think are the most crucial insights to give you a really well-informed perspective on this fascinating and, let's be honest, often disturbing subject.
And for this deep dive, we focused on two main sources, right?
That's right.
The Psychology of Cults from UT Permian Basin Online, and also Understanding Cults, the Basics from Psychology Today.
Both excellent resources.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the dynamics here, we probably need a clearer understanding of what we're actually talking about.
Definitely need a starting point.
The APA Dictionary to Psychology gives us a good baseline. It defines a cult as a religious or quasi-religious group characterized by unusual or atypical beliefs, seclusion from the outside world, and an authoritarian structure.
Hmm.
And it adds, cults tend to be highly cohesive, well-organized, secretive, and hostile to non-members.
Yeah, that covers a lot of the core elements. And building on that, our sources highlight some really consistent traits you tend to find across most groups labeled as cults.
Like what?
Well, they are almost universally led by a charismatic individual, someone who demands, essentially, unquestioning worship from their followers.
Right, that central figure.
Exactly. And quite often, these members don't just follow beliefs. They actually live together, maybe in a dedicated, often isolated community, kind of separate from mainstream society.
Which really begs the question, how does a structure like that, which seems so extreme and restrictive from the outside, how does that become appealing to someone in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do they get people in?
Yeah. You might picture, cults recruiting in some dark, secretive corner somewhere.
Right, like in the movies.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really insightful, based on the sources. The initial recruitment settings, they're surprisingly ordinary.
Okay.
We're talking social media, maybe your online discussion groups, community clubs, local events, basically, places you normally expect to meet new people.
So very public, very open spaces sometimes.
Yeah. Recruiters are skilled at identifying potential targets, getting to know them, and then they invite them to what seem like really innocent social gatherings. Maybe a casual dinner, a weekend workshop.
Something that doesn't raise any red flags initially.
Precisely. And these seemingly harmless invitations are actually the very first, really subtle steps towards being drawn into something much, much more insidious.
And this leads us straight into that core concept of vulnerability.
Uh, uh,
The people who tend to be receptive, they're often looking to escape something,
yeah.
maybe an unhappy life situation, yeah. And they're deeply seeking something else to belong, to feel accepted, to find meaning.
That makes sense.
And cults become incredibly adept at preying on precisely those vulnerabilities. They target specific groups sometimes.
Like who?
Well, the sources mention teenage runaways, people struggling with drug addiction, survivors of abuse, those grieving a really significant loss, like a death or a bad breakup.
So people in a fragile state.
Exactly. Or individuals grappling with insecurity, maybe mental health issues, or really just anyone feeling disconnected from society. That feeling of isolation is key.
Wow.
And the sources actually go deeper. They point to other vulnerabilities too, some situational, like, say, dealing with an illness or losing your job, or even the upheaval of moving to a new place.
So big life changes.
Big life changes, yeah. And then on an individual level, things like high hypnotizability.
Mm.
Some people are just naturally more suggestible, more easily engrossed in ideas,
Mm.
or having a really strong ability for concentration and vivid imagination. That can sometimes play a role.
Mm.
Even things like learning disorders or being on the autism spectrum might, in some cases, increase susceptibility, maybe making it harder to judge complex social cues or increasing a desire for very clear, defined structures, which cults often promise.
Right.
And of course, past trauma, unresolved sexual issues, even phobias can create openings.
So once a potential recruit is kind of brought into the group's orbit, maybe still unaware of the real agenda, what happens next? You mentioned something earlier, love bombing.
Yes, love bombing. This is a really powerful tactic, especially early on. The potential recruit is just absolutely showered with an overwhelming amount of love, attention, validation.
Wow.
It makes them believe they finally found it. The acceptance they've been craving, maybe even something better than they ever imagined.
Like finding the perfect family or community.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this intense initial embrace is absolutely critical in those early vulnerable stages. It creates this incredibly powerful sense of security and belonging,
Yeah.
making it much harder to question things later.
It's incredibly manipulative.
It is, and it's incredibly potent, especially when you combine it with those existing vulnerabilities we talked about.
Right.
And, in our modern world, those vulnerabilities are actually being sort of amplified by a whole new set of factors.
Oh, like what?
Well, think about the last few years. The COVID-19 pandemic, major economic disruption, all that increased isolation and social distancing.
Yeah, that definitely made people feel more alone.
For sure. Add intense social and political polarization, plus way more time spent online, the rise of internet addiction. All these factors contribute significantly to recruitment.
Recruitment into.
Not just traditional cults, but also into things like extreme conspiracy theories or even sophisticated online scams that use similar psychological tactics.
It's really chilling to hear you say that no one truly joins a cult voluntarily. They're recruited through these systematic processes. You called it undue influence.
That's the term, yes, undue influence. And a key part of that is the lack of informed consent.
So can you unpack that a bit more? What's the difference between just normal influence and this undue influence?
That's a really crucial distinction. Look, influence is everywhere, right?
Sure.
It's how we're shaped by our parents, our relationships, the media, education, even politics. That's what we call due influence.
Yeah.
And the hallmarks of due influence are things like your informed consent, genuine choice, the right to question things, listening to your own inner voice, your gut feeling, and crucially, the freedom to leave if you want to.
Right. You can walk away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But undue influence, that's something else entirely. It's deceptive by nature, it's manipulative, and it systematically works to suppress your inner voice, your critical thinking.
How does it do that?
It often involves isolation from outside perspectives,
Right.
pervasive control over your environment and information, the installation of fear of leaving, fear of the outside world, fear of the leader's disapproval, coercion, and ultimately it can lead to a form of mental enslavement.
Enslavement. That's a strong word.
It is, but it fits in some cases. And what's really fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is how subtle it can be. Sometimes it just gives you the illusion of informed choice. You think you're deciding things, but the options are carefully controlled.
Making it incredibly hard to even recognize you're being manipulated until you're really deep in. And the methods they use for taking control sound pretty insidious.
They are. New members are often systematically separated from their families, their friends, their jobs, basically cutting off their old support networks.
Isolating them.
Total isolation is often the goal. And then their very identities are slowly, painstakingly remade to suit the group's needs.
Remade. How?
Now, sometimes it involves forcing them to surrender their money, their personal belongings. Sometimes it extends to control over their own bodies, things like compelled marriages to other members.
Wow.
And punishment, deprivation, sleep deprivation, food deprivation, and constant threats are frequently used to wear people down. It makes new members utterly dependent on the group for everything and, frankly, terrified to even think about leaving.
That process of identity change you mentioned, that sounds particularly deep.
It really is. What's truly chilling about undue influence, according to the research, is how it doesn't just change your beliefs. It systematically works to rewrite your very sense of self.
So it's not like erasing the old you.
Not exactly erasing, no. It's more like creating a new identity, the cult identity, that actively suppresses the old pre-cult identity. Your original personality, values, beliefs, they get pushed down, sidelined.
And how is that done? Step by step?
Yeah, step by step. It happens through formal indoctrination sessions, lectures, readings, but also informally, through the constant reinforcement from other members.
Peer pressure, basically.
Intense peer pressure, yes.
Yeah.
Plus videos, games, movies, publications, even social and digital media tailored by the group. They use behavior modification techniques, carefully applied rewards, and punishments for conforming or questioning. Techniques like thought stopping are common methods taught to members to immediately shut down any critical thoughts or doubts that arise.
Wow.
And environmental control is huge isolation or restricted access to outside information, news, differing viewpoints.
And you mentioned sometimes it's about labor.
Yes, that's an important point too. Often, cult leaders want obedient individuals who will work extremely hard for little or no pay. Sometimes members are exploited for labor trafficking, essentially.
Gosh.
And the really unsettling thing is, because of this pervasive mind control, victims might actually appear happy on the outside. They might parrot the group's lines, seem content.
Masking what's really
Right.
going on internally.
Exactly, masking the internal conflict and the suppression of their own authentic self.
Okay, to really bring these principles home, these powerful, sometimes subtle psychological tactics, maybe we should look at some of the more notorious cases, the ones that really brought the dangers of cults into the public consciousness.
Yeah, looking at real-world examples definitely helps illustrate the patterns. We can start with the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones.
Jonestown.
Jonestown, exactly. This ended just horrifically with the mass murder-suicide event in Guyana. Over 900 people, including many, many children, died after being forced, some reportedly at gunpoint, to drink Flavor Aid laced with cyanide.
Just unimaginable.
Truly. Then there's a more recent case, Insivam. Outwardly, it presented itself as this executive coaching, self-help organization.
Right, I remember hearing about this one.
Yeah, but secretly, it was operating as a sex cult. The founder, Keith Raniere, was eventually convicted for crimes including assaulting and branding women. It also had a pyramid scheme structure. The involvement of actress Allison Mack really brought it a lot of media attention.
Yeah, that was shocking.
Then you have cases like Heaven's Gate, led by Marshall Applewhite. They had this belief that an extraterrestrial spacecraft was hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet,
Oh, yeah.
and this belief led directly to the mass suicide of 39 members. They believed they needed to shed their earthly bodies to be transported onto the spacecraft to reach a higher level.
So different motivations, but similar outcomes in some ways.
Similar mechanisms of control leading to extreme actions. And of course, there's the infamous Manson family. Charles Manson directed his followers, his family, to murder several people, most famously the pregnant actress Sharon Tate and her friends.
His goal was to start a race war, right? Helter-skelter.
That was the bizarre, apocalyptic motive he preached, yes. Using his followers to commit horrific violence to achieve his own ends.
And these aren't just historical footnotes. There are recent examples, too.
Absolutely. Like the Good News International Church in Kenya. The leader, Paul Mthenge Mackenzie, allegedly directed hundreds of his followers to starve themselves to death,
Starving the boss.
based on his prediction of a supposed world end date. They were told they needed to starve to meet Jesus. Hundreds of bodies were found.
That's horrifying. It's truly sobering hearing these stories laid out like that. Each one is just a profound human tragedy.
It really is.
Yet, as you said, they all seem to stem from that same manipulative blueprint, targeting vulnerability, exerting undue influence.
The patterns are remarkably consistent, even if the specific beliefs or the final outcomes vary wildly.
It's fascinating in a grim way how varied those outcomes can be. Mass suicide, murder, systematic exploitation, yet all rooted in those core psychological mechanisms we've been discussing. So what does this all mean for the individuals who've been involved? People who manage to get out. Our sources talk about lasting effects, right?
Yes, absolutely. The sources emphasize that the after effects of prolonged and intense coercive persuasion are often severe and long-lasting. Identity disturbance is a major consequence.
Identity disturbance, like not knowing who you are anymore.
Precisely. Extreme identity confusion is very common, but also things like panic attacks, severe anxiety, depression. Many former members experience psychosomatic symptoms.
You mean physical problems caused by the psychological stress?
Exactly. Things like chronic headaches, backaches, asthma flare-ups, skin problems, physical ailments deeply connected to the psychological trauma.
Wow.
Survivors often grapple with intense anger at the group, at the leader, sometimes at themselves. Guilt and shame are huge issues too. Many develop a kind of decision-making dependency, having had every choice made for them for so long.
I can imagine.
Deep-seated fears and phobias, often related to the group's doctrines or threats. Chronic sleep disorders, nightmares are common. Eating disorders can develop or worsen.
It sounds completely debilitating.
It can be. There's often a fear of intimacy and commitment, a deep distrust of other people, but also distrust of themselves, of their own judgment. There's a profound grieving process, grieving the loss of friends and family, maybe years of their life, the ideals they thought they found.
Yeah.
In some severe cases, you might see delusions, paranoia, a real loss of meaning or purpose in life. And quite frequently, clinicians diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD.
That's a heavy list.
It is. The damage can be very deep.
But is recovery possible?
Yes. And this is a really important point of hope. Recovery is absolutely possible.
Okay.
Our sources really stress the vital importance of education. Understanding the techniques used against you is incredibly empowering for prevention, but also for recovery.
Knowing it wasn't your fault.
Exactly. Knowing you were manipulated by sophisticated techniques, and there are resources available for those affected. Support from other former members who understand the experience can be invaluable.
Finding people who get it.
Yes. There are reputable websites, insightful books written by survivors and experts, and dedicated cult recovery specialists, therapists and counselors who understand these specific dynamics and can provide guidance and support. It's often a long and complex journey, recovery, but it is possible.
That's good to hear. This whole deep dive, it's really shown that understanding cults isn't just about, looking at bizarre beliefs or shocking headlines.
No, it goes much deeper.
It's really about recognizing those insidious psychological processes, how vulnerability is targeted, and how undue influence is systematically used to control people and ultimately to remake their identity.
Precisely. And I think in today's world, this era of just constant information overload, where subtle forms of manipulation and mind control feel like they're everywhere.
Online especially.
Online, in media, in politics. Developing strong critical thinking skills and robust media literacy, those are absolutely essential tools now.
More important than ever.
Vital for protecting yourself and protecting others from manipulation and harmful influences, whether they come from a cult or somewhere else entirely.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given what we've discussed, that undue influence works by creating this new identity that suppresses the old one. What does it really mean to truly choose your own identity in a world that's just saturated with influences, big and small? And maybe more importantly, how can you actively strengthen your own inner voice, that sense of self, to better resist manipulation, whether it's subtle or overt?